Hugh Stewart and this is News for Scotland on the Scotland Channel. We'll be bringing you daily news items through our social media channels. That's at News for Scotland on TikTok and YouTube. And a weekly roundup of the week's news every Friday night at 7 p.m. here on the Scotland Channel. What makes this show different to mainstream media news is that we cover the news mainstream media won't. We feel the people of Scotland deserve to know what's really happening in Scotland, not what London says is happening. So if you're new to our channel, please like, share and subscribe at youtube.com/@the-Scotland-Channel. Claims by Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves that Scottish salmon and whisky exports will be boosted by building a third runway at Heathrow have been described as a kick in the teeth for Scotland by independence blogger Leah Gunn-Barrett. Reeves made her comments this week as part of her big Kickstart economic growth initiative. Asked by Angus Robertson recently why Scottish exports should have to go through Heathrow at all, the Labour Chancellor refused to answer. Routing Scottish produce through England's largest airport is more costly and wastes more time reaching our worldwide markets. Ms Gunn-Barrett accused the Chancellor of wanting to make Scotland look like an economic basket case rather than the resource-rich country it is. Scottish exports forced to go through English ports are recorded as English revenues in order to make Scotland look artificially poor. Reeves announced a series of investments, all in the southeast of England. Scotland has been completely ignored, with no UK investment in this announcement. Scotland once had a burgeoning electronics export sector. In 2002, electronics exports were 5.6 billion, 28% of Scotland's exports. By 2014, they had fallen to 1.1 billion, 4%. Yet Reeves is lavishing Oxford and Cambridge with money to construct a Silicon Valley near London. It's a safe bet any investment in AI won't stray out of the southeast, says Ms Gunn-Barrett. Meanwhile, Grangemouth is closing with the loss of hundreds of jobs because 60 million couldn't be found to invest in a new hydrocracker. Scotland's Business Minister Richard Lochhead has been talking to Axion Space, a company from Houston, Texas, about involvement in the latest commercial space lab project. Mr Lochhead said that countries are queuing up to have a lab in space and asked if Scotland wants to be a leader or a follower. There are scientific experiments which can only be done under low gravity conditions and there's money to be made from this growing space sector. Scotland, soon to be the site of a new spaceport, is well placed to compete. The homegrown space industry is going through a period of fast growth as Scotland builds more satellites than any other country in Europe. When Glasgow hosted the first Spacecom Expo last September, Richard Lochhead said that Scotland was poised to capture 4 billion of the global space market, supporting around 8,000 jobs here. The WEF predicts that the space sector will soon be worth $1.8 trillion and there could be 50,000 satellites in orbit, many of them made in Scotland. A campaign group says that Scotland's 2 new free ports set up by the UK government in England are illegal under Scots law. The challenge comes from the Salvo Free Ports campaign and it says that the land assets signed over to private corporations belong to the people of Scotland under Scots law and therefore cannot be sold on by the government in London acting under the English Crown. And in a documentary now on the Scotland Channel, Sarah Salyers says that the group has written to companies concerned warning them that any deals they have entered into with the government in England could be challenged regardless of any adversar-state dispute settlement agreements signed. Those are agreements which are designed to effectively fireproof corporate deals with governments. Now let's hear more from Sarah Salyers.
What would stop them? I'm not sure anything short of independence can stop them, but you need also to be aware that independence in and of itself won't stop them, because there are things called ISDS agreements, which have to do with international corporate rights. Once a corporation enters into a contract in good faith with the government that has said, this is here's the contract, here are the terms. If there's a change of government, a change of regime, that doesn't mean you can automatically say, well, you're out, we're taking it all back, because they entered that contract in good faith. and they are, and what ISDS provisions do is they fireproof these corporate contracts against these changes that happen in, all over the world. There has to be, as they see it, there has to be some way of making sure that they're not vulnerable to volatile political conditions. So what we've done is that we have issued notice to every single one that this is being done through the auspices of a foreign crown, that the legal owners of the territory, the territorial assets, the territory and the maritime assets of Scotland are the people under the Scottish Crown. And you cannot sell or rent out something you don't own. Therefore, we are giving you notice. These contracts will likely be declared what it's called void ab initio. They will be liable for rescission, I think is the word, to be set aside, and you can't claim that you didn't know because we told you. That they don't believe us and haven't bothered to respond is their lookout.
And the full documentary Freeports Selling Off Scotland is available to watch now on the Scotland Channel. Now we hear the number of English-born voters living in Scotland prepared to vote for Scottish independence is in the majority for the first time ever. According to the campaign group Believe in Scotland, the group says that if independence is predicated on the introduction of a well-being economy, 54% of English voters now living here say they would vote yes to independence. Previously, only 39% said they would support Scotland's independence. There's around 450,000 English people who have moved to Scotland, representing about 9% of the population. Founder and Chief Executive of Believe in Scotland, Gordon McIntyre Kemp, said the group have been campaigning in the Borders and Dumfries and Galloway areas with more English-born voters than in other parts of Scotland. When a positive vision of the type of Scotland that can be created through independence is presented, support jumps by 17% up to 56%. Next, an authoritative report has found that poverty among families with children is lower in Scotland than it is in England. The study by the Social Metrics Commission found that 26% of couples with children are in poverty in England. In Scotland, the figure is 23%. In England, more than half of lone parents, 54%, are in poverty, whereas in Scotland, the number is 48%. The Scottish Government says it has paid out more than £1 billion in extra benefits to help lift children out of poverty. These Scottish payments are made to every child in the family, despite continuing cuts to the overall budget from Westminster. In contrast, the UK Government's two-child benefits cap is paid only to the two oldest children, pushing many families into poverty. The Child Poverty Action Group has calculated that this measure, which affects children born after 2017, has pushed 10,000 children into poverty so far. Child poverty in the UK is rising in the international league tables and is now much higher than in comparably similar-sized countries, many of them without Scotland's wealth of natural resources, yet they are performing far better than the UK. 20 years ago, Scotland had significantly higher rates of child poverty than England. It tracked then with the poorest areas of the British Isles. Now it tracks with the most prosperous part of the UK, the south of England, in a turnaround of historic significance. The Social Metrics report revealed that poverty in Scottish families is lower than in England, despite big cost of living rises, including high energy prices, something the Better Together campaign said would not happen if Scotland voted to remain in the UK in 2014. Now let's look at water bills. Water bills in England look set to rise by more than 50% in some areas as debt-laden private companies struggle to avoid bankruptcy. In Scotland, water bills are expected to rise by around 8% this year. England is the only country in the developed world to have fully privatised its water. The UK government had wanted to privatise Scotland's water too, but thanks to a poll carried out by the then Strathclyde Regional Council in '94, that showed that 97% of Strathclyde residents were opposed to privatisation. Westminster dropped its plans in Scotland, but 2 years later abolished the Strathclyde Regional Council. Since then, Scotland's publicly owned domestic water supply has not only seen lower bills than England, but cleaner waterways too. The gulf in average water charges between England and Scotland is widening and looks set to increase. Between 2002 and 2018, Scottish Water invested on average nearly 35% more per household than English water companies. That's in infrastructure repairs and improvements. These are according to researchers at London's Greenwich University. That's essentially because money paid to Scottish Water doesn't go to dividends to shareholders. In England, the water companies have paid £52 billion in dividends to shareholders since 1990. Many of England's privatised water companies are struggling under huge debt. Thames Water, for example, is in particularly dire straits. It had to borrow £3 billion in 24 to avoid going bankrupt this year. When it was privatised in 1989, it had no debt, but the new owner, Macquarie, used the guaranteed income stream from households to borrow money, most of which has gone to its shareholders. That money has not been invested in infrastructure, and some companies have been found manipulating their testing to hide sewage discharge. Many English water companies are routinely fined. Just last summer in England, the Office of Water and Regulatory Affairs, that's Ofwat, proposed fines of a total of £168 million for 3 water companies in England who failed to manage their wastewater treatment and networks. Thames Water was fined £104 million, Yorkshire Water £47 million, and Northumbria Water was fined £17 million. In contrast, Scottish Water was last fined £19,000, and that was in 2020. Unionist politicians sometimes try to make out that the situation in Scotland is the same as England. On a recent BBC Question Time on the telly, one panellist was allowed to claim that Scotland has the same water pollution issues in England, unchallenged by the chair Fiona Bruce. This is not true. In Scotland, 87% of water bodies achieve good or better water quality, and they're among the best in Europe. Only 14% of England's water bodies are rated good or excellent. So just how did Scotland manage to keep its water supply in public hands during the era of ideological privatisation when other utilities were sold off? Gas, electricity, national grid, the railways, etc. Let's look in more detail at that referendum in 1994. The UK government did attempt to privatise water in Scotland, but there was united opposition. Water had been privatised in England under Margaret Thatcher, and in 1994 the Conservative government under John Major geared up to do the same in Scotland. This was a period when demands for Scotland to have more control over its affairs were building. The plans to privatise Scottish Water met a massive wall of opposition. The Strathclyde Regional Council decided to hold an advisory referendum to test the strength of feeling. They held a postal ballot, and it had a huge turnout of 71.5% of electors in Strathclyde returning their papers. An extraordinary 97.2% wanted Scottish Water to remain in public hands. No to privatisation votes numbered 1,194,667, with no votes at just under 34,000. That referendum had no legal force at the time. The UK government still had the legal power to do what it wished with Scottish Water, and at that time Scotland didn't even have a parliament or national assembly. It was run by the Westminster Grand Committee on Scottish Affairs, which was regularly stuffed with English MPs from the Shires because there were too few Scottish Conservatives to vote through the government's plans. OK, we've heard of 2 massive power batteries being constructed. Scotland makes most of the UK's wind electricity and could make more, but the problem has always been the storage. If the windmills generate too much electricity when demand is low, there has to be some way to store it till when it's needed. Now, News for Scotland on the Scotland Channel has heard about 3 massive storage batteries to be built in Scotland. These will be the biggest in Europe. The Colburn 1 project is already under construction in South Lanarkshire, and the energy firm Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners have announced that they will also build Colburn 2 as well as a plant in Fife. These giant batteries will be connected to the grid by 27-28 and will have a capacity of 500 megawatts, larger than any other battery in Europe. These will store up to 3 gigawatts per hour, enough to run 4.5 million households for 2 hours. The industry says that Scotland is the ideal location for battery storage, both because we have a surplus of renewable wind energy and the problems of an electricity grid suffering from a lack of investment. By 2030, it's estimated that 60% of the UK's electricity will come from wind turbines, and more than half of that will be generated in Scotland. NatureScot, the Scottish Government's nature agency, is to axe a free service for people needing advice on bats, and a move critics fear could result in desperate householders illegally destroying bat roosts. From April, householders will have to pay for guidance on how to manage bats roosting in their roofs following the decision. This move will involve the redundancy of 27 bat workers employed in 0 hours contracts, for a saving of around £30,000 from NatureScot's annual budget of £68.2 million. Under a free advice scheme called Bats in Houses, householders were able to call a helpline if they had bats roosting in their roof space, and if necessary organise a visit from an experienced bat worker to agree on a suitable course of action. Bats have been a protected species in Scotland since 1994, and the free helpline service has been in operation since 2003. The Bat Conservation Trust commented that it does not agree with the decision to scrap the scheme and says it could lead to desperate householders illegally destroying bat roosts. And that winds up our news stories for this week, so I hope you'll join us again next week on the Scotland Channel, Fridays at 7 p.m, for more news for Scotland. I'm Hugh, thanks for watching. We'll see you later.